Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Simone. I'm community manager with the OED marketing team, and I'm delighted to be here today with my colleagues and our guest speakers. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our panel chair, Dr. Danica Salazar, so she can do a round of introductions and begin the discussion, and I'll disappear behind the scenes. So, Danica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Simone. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. So, today we'll be time traveling through the history of the English language and guiding us throughout the journey as a distinguished panel of experts on linguistics and lexicography. As Simone mentioned, my name is Danica Salazar, and I am executive editor for World Englishes for the Oxford English Dictionary. And with me on the panel are two of my colleagues on the OED, Executive Editor for External Engagement, Fiona McPherson, and Editor Mohammed Eric Lacey. Also joining us are guest speakers from the Department of English Language and Literature of University College London. We have lecturer in Old and Middle English Literature, Dr. Amy Faulkner, Quirk Lecturer in English Linguistics, Dr. Tian Wilson, and Associate Professor in the History of the English Language, Dr. Catherine Allen. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we start the conversation, let's first do a poll. You may know the answer to this question, or you can give it your best guess, and we're going to reveal the answer at the end of the event. So you better stick around until the end if you want to know the answer. So the question is, what is the oldest word? Well, not generally, but what is the oldest word among those words listed here on your screen that you can see right now? Is it the adjective well in the sense of tasty? Is it friend used as a verb? Digital? OMG as an interjection? The noun staycation? And the noun mixologist. So which of those words do you think are the oldest in the English language? And we'll reveal the answer in an hour or so. So in the meantime, let's get started and I'd like to begin by asking each of you on the panel to talk a little bit about your background, your current role, and your work on researching the history of English. So let's start with the OED people first. Fiona.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm Fiona McPherson. I work in the New Words department of the OED, which maybe sounds like I'm only there for dealing with brand new neologisms and, words that have come in the last 10 years or so. But as we often find out, things are much older than they usually seem normally. So sometimes these words do have quite a long history, which means that my background, which I studied at the University of Glasgow in the English language department, that does come in handy quite some time. We went back to Old English, Middle English, and the history of English. So it's not just brand new words that I'm dealing with every day. Some of them do have much longer histories than you might first imagine. So it keeps me on my toes.
Let's go over to you, Eric.
Hello, yeah, I'm Eric. I'm on the research team at the OED, and unlike Fiona and Danica, I'm quite new to the OED, but I have spent a good long while researching and teaching in linguistics, literature, and history at universities in the UK before coming to this role. So it's quite exciting to see the differences between how my past life would treat it, and as I currently do on a day-to-day basis, looking at a whole variety of words across the entire spectrum of the history of the English language.
Great, and we're so happy to have you on as one of the newest members of our team, Eric. Okay, and now let's move on to our guest from UCL, starting with Catherine. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Sure, thanks, Danica. So I'm Catherine Allen. I also studied at the University of Glasgow. Other Scottish universities are available, but there's just a particularly good Department of English Language at Glasgow. And that's where I did my undergraduate degree and my PhD there as well. And actually, I worked as a PhD student and subsequently on the historical thesaurus of the OED. And that's something that I'll show a little bit of material for later on. So it's a project to turn the OED the other way around and organise it semantically. And OED now has the thesaurus integrated into it. So there are links under the senses of some words where you can find historical thesaurus material. So I did some work for the historical thesaurus, and I worked on some of the data from the historical thesaurus. I worked at University of Salford, and then I came to UCL quite some time ago.
Right. Thanks, Catherine. And now Amy.
Thanks. Danica, yeah, so my name's Amy Faulkner, and I'm a lecturer in Old and Middle English here at UCL. My research specialism is in Old English literature, but I teach across Old and Middle English. I did my PhD at the University of Oxford, and my interest has always primarily been literary in Old English literature. But when studying the literature of the medieval period, you're perhaps maybe a bit more aware of language than in other periods, because there's always that element of translating and interpretation. And in fact, some of my past research has looked at word studies, so tracking the appearance and distribution of words across the literature of the period. So although I'm a literary scholar, my work does lend itself to the study of language.
Thank you. And finally, Gian.
So hello, thank you everyone. My name is Gian Wilson, and I am originally from Trinidad and Tobago, and most of my family still lives there. And I'm currently quick lecturer in English linguistics at UCL. I think I said that, sorry. Yeah, and I did my PhD at the University of Münster in Germany, and I did the German habilitation at the University of Bochum. My research area is World Englishes, and it's quite broad in World Englishes. I'm sort of interested in everything, but especially English in the Caribbean and its links to English in West Africa, which is what the topic of my habilitation was. And my most recent book was actually on language on TikTok and Facebook. So again, really broad ranging. But in the last few years, I've made a sort of turn in my research focus. And right now I'm really interested in the development of English in the Caribbean, especially from the early 19th century onwards. And I'm involved in building a historical corpus, firstly of English in Trinidad and Tobago, and then later on I hope to expand it to other islands, looking at English in those islands from the, like I said, early 19th century to the present day, looking at how that develops over time and how norms develop, so how they become, not how those islands don't just go through independence politically, but whether that and how that happens in the language.
Thanks, Gian. Well, I guess I have to say a few words about myself as well as your panel chair. As I mentioned, my name is Danica, and I am also a member of the OED editorial team. I'm originally from the Philippines, and I actually studied Spanish at the university over there in the Philippines, and then I did my postgraduate work in the University of Salamanca and the University of Barcelona, so it was when I was doing my PhD in Barcelona, where I specialized in lexicography, and that's how I ended up doing a postdoc in Oxford on the Oxford English Dictionary and its coverage of World Englishes. And I guess people just got used to having me around, just hanging out there, where I just refused to leave. And then I was offered an editor position, which I've held for 11 years now. And my area of specialization is, the same as Diane, so World Englishes, so looking at documenting different varieties of English in the OED. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that later on in the panel. And actually, one of the great things about my job is that I get to collaborate with a lot of people who share the same research interests, and that includes our guests from UCL here on the panel. And so I've had, in recent months, I've spent a lot of time hanging out with them in London, doing some really exciting stuff relating to a project that they started called From Old English to World Englishes. So, Gian, could you talk a little bit more about that great new initiative that you started?
Yeah, thank you. So it's the first time we launched it was the first event we had that you were invited to was in November. But I always sort of think of the project as starting long before, because even when I was in secondary school, I was learning Chaucer and Chinua Achebe in the same term, and it sort of intrigued me. Well, how did English move from this to this, like in 500 years? What happened? And I've been very lucky at UCL to have colleagues like Amy and Catherine who indulge my curiosities. And the aim of this project has always been to explore the development of English vocabulary from the Old English period to the contemporary period, specifically looking at two things, I think. One is the sources of the English vocabulary, so where's the vocabulary coming from? And the other is word formation, so how are new words being formed? Because you get really interesting word formation processes. But the From Old English to World English, this project isn't strictly speaking scholarly. I mean, we are all scholars, but it's not scholarly in that sense, because it's always been an engagement project. So it was conceptualized as part of the Being Human Festival, which is a humanities festival that challenges academics to take their work or take our work into the public and share that work with the public. And so as part of that Being Human Festival, we designed this project. And we received funding from the festival, and we held our first event last year at Dr. Johnson's house, because as part of that, one of the things of Being Human Festival is you're not allowed to just tell people, come to the university, you have to go out to them. And so we were really very fortunate being in London to have Celine Lupo-McDade from Dr. Johnson's house. She's the curator of Dr. Johnson's house. Say, yes, you can come and have an event here. And Dr. Johnson, as many of you I'm sure know, is the editor, author of one of the earliest and very important dictionaries of the English language. And then, of course, we thought, well, if we have Dr. Johnson, we must also have the OED. And so we invited Danica to come along as well. And what happens is that really school children, they come and they participate in a range of events, a range of activities. And one of my activities has fallen, so you're not going to see that anymore, which takes you through the history of English. So they start with Old English, and Amy will show you some later on. And then they go to Middle English, and we show them like words from that come through French and words that come through English, and they have to do the that activity. So the one that fell was the French word, which would have been monarch. And here we have king, the Old English word, and so they have to guess where the words come from. We have a map of the world where people have to. So some of the words on the maps would be words like alu, and they have to guess where that comes from, an alligator, or they could engage with dictionaries from different parts of the world. And that project has really grown now from beyond what we had at Dr. Johnson's house to something that we've received funding for to continue in the broader community. So we've been to Brixton Library, to Lewis Carroll Library near King's Cross, and we'll be continuing it for the next 2 years. So if you're a teacher out there and you're listening to this and you think, oh, this is something I'd like my students to do, just email one of us and we'll be happy to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan. I mean, doing that talk as part of the first event at Dr. Johnson's house was one of the highlights of the last year for me. And I think what we're going to do in this panel, kind of try to recreate the sort of the journey that we've curated for the school kids for you here now. There won't be any of those fun games with the tiles that Jan has just shown, but we'll try to make it as fun as we can, even though we're not at Dr. Johnson's house, and you can see glimpses of our houses and offices instead. Okay, so now let's get started with that by turning to Amy, and we're going to go back 1,000 years to the very beginnings of the English language. So, in general parlance, people tend to use the phrase Old English just really to mean anything that sounds even a little bit old-timey, but we all know as historical lexicographers, as historical linguists, that in historical linguistics, Old English actually refers to a very specific period of the history of the language. So could you tell us a little bit, when was this period and what were England and its people like during this time, and what were the characteristic features of their of the people who lived in England?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that when we use the phrase Old English, we're actually talking about the very earliest stage in the history of the English language. And obviously, it's really hard to give precise dates here, but the beginning of the Old English period is normally dated to around the year 600, and the end point to around the year 1150. So in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, not immediately afterwards, but in the aftermath. And then in terms of what England and its people were like then, the earliest speakers of Old English were the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who arrived in Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries in the wake of the Roman withdrawal from Britain. So this is when the Roman Empire has ended and the Romans withdraw, and into that void steps Germanic tribes. They are pagans at this point, and they displace or enslave the British who are living there. And the British people speak of a variety of different Celtic languages. And I said that these Germanic invaders are pagans. It's hard to say exactly what that religious practice looked like. It probably resembled something like the Norse paganism that is described much later by Scandinavian Christians much later in the medieval period. But we know very little about what that paganism would have looked like, because at the time of the migration and the settlement, the culture of these tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, was a primarily oral one rather than a literate one. So there's very little written down. We can infer little snatches and glimpses from about their religion and their culture, but it's hard to get a clear picture. But this all changes during the late 6th and 7th centuries when these tribes, these Germanic tribes, are converted to Christianity by missionaries from both Rome and Ireland. There's a sort of pincer movement from Rome and the north. And then they do adopt this sort of literate culture. And over the course of the early medieval period, literary cultures in both Latin and the vernacular really do start to flourish. And this is the really important thing, I think, about the early medieval period, sometimes known as the Anglo-Saxon period, or in the old days, the Dark Ages, is that it's not the Dark Ages at all, because it's a culture which is characterized by a literary vernacular. So lots and lots is written in the vernacular in Old English, not just in Latin. So a little bit about how they were writing. So before the coming of Christianity, as I said, Old English was mainly a spoken language. But when it was written down, it was written down using runes. And people might have heard of runes. They are a Germanic alphabet. So we now use the Roman alphabet in English for writing English, and in the very early stages of Old English, they use this different alphabet, runes, where the characters are all ideally designed for carving. So the shapes of runes are all made up of very angular lines. And the really interesting thing I think about the runic alphabet is that each character represents not only a sound, but also a concept. So, for example, the rune for the sound w or for w also represents the concept win, which means happiness or joy. And I think there might be a slide which shows this archaic word win, which means joy, which we have now unfortunately lost from the language. It's a lovely word. So that's the really interesting thing about runes, is that they both have a sound and also a name. But as I said, with the coming of Christianity, Old English speakers are introduced to the Roman alphabet through Latin religious texts. And after they adopt Christianity, the early medieval English begin to use the Roman alphabet to write Old English. But there are some problems here, because there are some sounds in Old English, spoken Old English, which don't have corresponding letters in Latin. So, for example, the th sound, which we have in English now, has no counterpart in Latin. So what they did is took some runes. The rune for the th sound, which is known as a thorn, looks like a B with a long ascender, or a B with a long descender, or a P with a long ascender. And they adopt that to use in their own alphabet. So runes had a really practical role in the development of English as a written language, but they also had a cryptic or esoteric, even playful role in English as well. So there's lots to think about there. I want to move on and talk a little bit about some of the grammatical characteristics of Old English. So Old English is what is known as a synthetic language, which means that its inflections tell you what role those words play in the sentence, meaning that the word order is more flexible than in present-day English, which is known as an analytic language. Another important difference is grammatical gender. So in Old English, nouns can belong to one of three grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and obviously we have now lost that. So when you're looking at an Old English noun, it will have many more inflections than we have. and it will belong to one of the three genders. The other main difference with Old English nouns compared to present-day English nouns is that there's a distinction between strong and weak. And one of the main differences in terms of Old English strong and weak nouns is that many weak nouns form their ending with an an at the end, a n sound. And this ending now survives only in a couple of nouns like children and oxen, for example. There aren't many, or indeed any others possibly, that have that an residual an ending. Old English, like modern English, also has strong and weak verbs, that same distinction. And we have that now still in present day English. You think about the difference between I run versus I ran, where there's a change in that root vowel to form the past tense. It's known as a strong verb. And likewise, the comparison between I play versus I played. That's a weak noun where the ending is created with a dental suffix. So Old English has that same distinction, but the important thing is that it has many more strong verbs, and we've lost some of those strong verbs in present-day English. And when we create new ones, we tend to make them weak. And I think the last thing I want to talk about now is the sort of characteristics of Old English vocabulary. So Old English does borrow words. It borrows words from languages such as Latin, the Celtic varieties, and Old Norse. However, compared to other varieties of English, loan words make up a really small proportion of the vocabulary. So some examples might include tor, which means rock, which comes from the Old Welsh tur, meaning a bulge or belly. And yeah, we have a slide there to show that. And I believe that's where the name of Glastonbury Tor comes from. There are some more examples on the handout that should be available with some more information. But we also have, just to take an example, from Old Norse, utlaga, the word for outlaw, and from Latin, for example, papa, which means pope. So from the field of religion. But when Old English wants to make new words, when Old English speakers want to make new words, they tend to do so more often through compounding, through putting two existing nouns or a noun and an adjective together to create a new word. And that's more the way that new words are created rather than through loaning. And this is something which we might hear more about over the course of the seminar, the webinar. And the very final thing to mention in vocabulary is a special sort of compound which we see specifically in Old English poetry known as a kenning. So kennings, as I say, are compounds, but they are slightly different from normal compounds in that the meaning is not immediately obvious, but rather demands some interpretation to work out the relationship between the two parts of the compound or the kenning. And this was the basis of the activity that we did for the Old English part of the from Old English to World English. Some examples might include fron rad, where fron means whale and rad means road. These are the tiles that we used for the event. Fron rad, you ask yourself, okay, whale road. Well, what sort of a road might a whale use? The answer is the ocean or the sea. So they require a little bit of interpretation. Anyway, that leads me on then to the next poll, I believe. So I believe that you should see another poll soon. And I've already given you the example of Fronrad, which means whale road. You have to do that little bit of interpretation. What is a road which a whale might use? So the example I've given you is Barnhus, which literally means bone house. And I've given you 6 possible interpretations, 6 possible meanings of what this kenning might mean. So have a go at working it out, and the answer will be revealed. I think that's all from me now. So I'm going to hand back to Danica.
Right. Thanks. Thank you, Amy. Now, Eric, I'd like to turn to you now because, as we can see from the examples that Amy has given, a great deal of really the core vocabulary of modern English, or the most basic words that we use today, goes back to Old English. And as an historical dictionary, the OED features quotation evidence for some of these oldest words in English. And you, Eric, as an OED editor, you work on some of the earliest material available to lexicographers and historical linguists. So what are these texts and what is the OED's policy on including and dating them?
Well, I won't sit here and just enumerate the Old English texts because there's quite a lot of them, and they actually fall across quite a broad breadth of different genres. So we have playful riddle texts, we have contemplative philosophical texts about the nature of life, the universe, everything else, scientific texts, dragon slaying, of course, have to have a good dose of that, and also texts that you might not realize were functional texts like law codes, charters that indicate where the boundaries of land were, and even penitentials, which are these little handbooks that tabulate sins and then say, if you've done this sin, this many Hail Marys or this many days fasting, bread and water. So there's this enormous amount of literature in Old English, especially compared to what people think of the period, and it covers a whole range of different areas, which is why we can see words to do with the natural environment, to do with philosophical concepts, like a lovely Old English word Fortjeschaft that refers to the notion of creation across the entirety of time. Wonderful concept. Anhage, a meditative philosophical concept about being enclosed in your own thoughts and therefore away from everybody else through this psychological barrier. And at the OED, we get to tabulate these and talk about their meanings in each of their contexts. Now, we don't do it for every word in Old English. So if you've been conjuring up the OED to look up Fortjeschaft or Anhage, my very, very bad news is that those words aren't in the OED. They're just too early. And in fact, it would be a tremendous undertaking to extend the OED back to cover all of Old English. Thankfully, another project is on that, the Dictionary of Old English, and they're tabulating all the Old English words. We, since the very first incarnation of the OED in the 19th century, have focused only on those words that we see in living use after 1150. It doesn't matter how much further after 1150, so we've got some rather obscure senses, like our earliest sense of bid means to offer somebody something, and that stops around the 15th century, but because we have it after 1150, it's in the OED. Now, because Old English is quite problematic in terms of thinking of who composed texts. We could get Amy talking all day about the issues of Alfred and what extent he composed texts and what extent it was a collaborative effort that used Alfred as a brand name. But because there are these issues of authorship, we don't actually try and find an original date for composition when we're citing from Old English in the OED. What we do is we go by the manuscript witness, the earliest time it's put down in writing and that we can date a physical text. Now, these are broad brushstroke datings, and that means that we really try and reflect that in our structure of the OED. We'll have early Old English, EOE, which is anything that's in a manuscript before 950. We've got OE, which is between 950, the Benedictine reform that led to a big urge of manuscript production until about 1100. And then after 1100, we have all of the impacts of the Norman conquest kick in. We still have some Old English texts between 1100 and 1150, and we call those late Old English. Now, to illustrate this, rather conveniently, we've got the example of wood, in the sense that you'll know of a wooded area, like going into the woods for a walk. And we see in an early Old English text, this is a charter that says, all of the land Butan them Seltern at Feversham, except for the Saltern, the salt mine at Feversham, and except for the woods that border onto them. Now, because that's 950, we're just going to say early Old English. There are lots of problems about when it was actually written down, and we're just going to brush that under the carpet and say it's old. It's really, really old. Then we've got Old English, which is weird to think about when we're talking about Old English generally, but OE is 950 to 1100, and we have most of our Old English texts And here we have a saint's life that says, he rushed into the woods where it was thickest. And do you remember Amy said that there are 3 genders in Old English and that things were assigned a gender? Here we see he referring back to the woods, where the woods were thickest, and yet we're using the pronoun he, which we think of as a masculine pronoun, as an actual gendered pronoun to refer to grammatical gender. And then an example of late Old English is from an Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry composed in 1112 that says this was a very good year and very abundant in woods and in the fields. So the fields were flourishing, the woods were flourishing. And because it was after the Norman conquest, we're going to say late Old English to allow for some of these influences from French. Now, if we had multiple quotes from early Old English or late Old English, we wouldn't attempt to do a chronology with them. They're really just there for vibes, for aesthetics, perhaps thematically grouped, because of those issues of trying to date them more specifically. So everything's done in broad brushstrokes, and hopefully this explains some of our dating principles behind it. Now, before I talk too much about the pronoun he, I think we better pass it on to someone else.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Eric. So yeah, that's really fascinating about Old English. And I mean, it's interesting that when we think of, when you're talking about dates like 950, it seems like so long ago, but it's interesting to see, like, we have the same we do share the same interests, like law and religion, like the same things that we write. The same reasons that we write things now is the same that our ancestors did when they were still speaking Old English. So that's really interesting. But now I think we're moving on to another period in the development of the English language, and that's Middle English. And what's notable about it is it's really a period of great change for both the English people and their language. So now, Catherine, what events happened during this time that ended up having a major impact on the development of English?
Okay, thanks, Danica. I would love to hear more about the pronoun he all day, Eric, but nevertheless, we'll move on. So Amy talked about the movement of peoples as marking the sort of start of the Old English period. The Germanic peoples, and the big event that begins the Middle English period is also to do with people arriving in England, but in this case it's an invasion, and the Norman conquest has already been mentioned. So you've got the Battle of Hastings, the big decisive event in 1066, and as Eric already said, we tend to date the beginning of the Middle English period. I think Amy referred to this as well. We tend to date the beginning of the Middle English period a little bit later than that. So the date that OED uses is 1150, and that's to allow for the impact of the conquest on English specifically. So William the Conqueror takes the English throne, and the English aristocracy are replaced by French-speaking nobles from Normandy. So the ruling class is talking Norman French, and the variety spoken in England is often referred to as Anglo-Norman. And that's the term I think that the OED usually uses. So then you've got this situation during the Middle English period where England is a multilingual society. And you've mainly got 3 languages that are being used, and each of these have different functions. So Amy talked about Latin. Latin's still important in the Middle English period as the language of the church. It's an important language in education. It's the language of permanent record, and that's the case for a long time after. So the Domesday Book, written in the late 11th century, and that's written in Latin. But then because of the conquest, you've also got Anglo-Norman, this variety of French, and it's being used by powerful people. So it's a prestige language, and it's more prestigious than English. And then, of course, you've still got English. It's being used by all the speakers who were there all along, but mostly it isn't being used to write important documents. It's not a language of record, and it's not used in political writing much, for example. There's not much surviving literature written in English in the first half of the period either. But this changes as the period goes on. So by Chaucer's time, because of social and political changes, English is gradually being used again in more context. And of course, Chaucer famously writes in English. But this is an English that's very much influenced by French and Latin. And I think Eric's going to say a bit more in a moment about the fact that there's not a clear separation between these languages because lots of speakers are using more than one in different functions. So we might think of two particularly significant effects that I'll mention of this big historical change. So firstly, we can talk a little bit about spelling variation. And that really relates to the function of English in this period. English isn't being written down in as many contexts, as I said. Texts that are written in English tend not to travel very far. They tend to have a localized use. There's no standard variety in this period. And differences in spoken varieties, therefore, are reflected a lot in written English. And if you think about the difference in present-day English, you can't tell from my writing generally that I'm a Scottish English speaker because I tend to write in standard English, but that's completely different in the Middle English period. So if we could have the slide for the word through. This is a well-known and quite extreme example, if you like, of the kind of level of spelling variation that you can see in some words in this period. And this is just a selection of the spellings of through that are recorded. You see early on in the slide there the forms in Old English. There are a few different ones. You see variation, of course, but if you look then at the box on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see there's enormous numbers of variants recorded that are found in the Middle English period. Thanks very much. So if we move on to think a little bit about lexical variation again, then this is the other major change we see. So Amy mentioned borrowing, and there's very much increased borrowing in the Middle English period, particularly from French and Latin. So to illustrate this, I just wanted to show you a little bit of data from the historical thesaurus that I mentioned before. If we could have the slide for Noble, please. So the historical thesaurus is integrated into the OED, as I said, and it collects together under each sense of a word the different words that are used to express that concept over time. So I use, in my own research, I use historical thesaurus data a lot. I'm really interested in this idea of the different words that are used to express a concept and the changes that we see. I mentioned the nobility, thank you very much, a moment ago. Lots of words to do with the nobility are borrowed from French in this period. Understandably, the nobility are French. So, for example, prince, princess, baron, monarch that Gian mentioned earlier, royal, regal. And if you compare the word monarch to the word king, monarch is the kind of higher register, fancier word in modern English. And that really shows the kind of stylistic variation that you begin to see in this period that we still have in English. But if you look on this slide, so these are different words that are used for the first sense of noble that's recorded in English, and that's famous, basically. So the words that are there, this is just a selection, I should say. The words that are there that we find in the Old English period, athel and couth, these are native Germanic words. But then we begin to see recorded from the Middle English period words from elsewhere. So we have noble, borrowed from French. We have famous, also borrowed from French. Glorified is formed in English from glorify, which is borrowed from French. Heroical, a bit later on, borrowed from Latin. Heroic plus that al ending that's from English. And then there's another word here that's really interesting, which is keat, this one here, which is recorded from around 1275. Now that's got a kind of uncertain etymology, but OED says it might be borrowed from Scandinavian. And what we also see in the Middle English period is the evidence for words that are borrowed in Scandinavian that we think are earlier, but don't really get set down until the Middle English period. There's a really interesting piece on the OED website about this, actually. Yeah, so much more kind of variation in the lexicon because of borrowing from these other languages. And it's mostly the borrowing that we see doesn't tend to replace the kind of basic frequent words that we find in English. But there are some words that are more frequent that are of French origin in modern English, like personal, for example, a person, which is borrowed in this period. And just to finish off, I'll just say something about what's happening grammatically in this period, because Amy talked about that a bit. Old English is a synthetic language that has these case distinctions and this grammatical gender, but in Middle English, that system really breaks down. So we see the simplification of the inflectional ending system over the period, something much closer to what we have in modern English with this analytic system. And I better stop. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Catherine. So, well, Eric, I'll go back to you. And so Catherine spoke about the multilingualism of English society during the Middle English period, which we can see in the regional variation in surviving Middle English texts. So could you describe these texts a little bit and the particular challenges that OED editors sometimes face in dating them?
There's a lot, so I'll try and keep it brief.
Lots of challenges.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that really comes out in Middle English is regional variation. We did have dialects in Old English, and they are very clearly evidential, but for historical reasons, most texts were written in West Saxon, so there isn't as much written in other dialects. When we get to Middle English, we can have texts that are like the Cursor Mundi, written in a northern dialect and a southern dialect. And although they're the same text, they've got such different words and concepts in them because they've been translated and then reworked for very specific audiences. Now, rather than go and talk about all the different dialects, I'll just say they're all there. There's lots of them. And I want to move on and talk about what Catherine was talking about with interlingual communication and texts across these different languages, because this is probably more marked in our evidence than the dialects. You either go, this is Northern, this is Southern, this is East Anglian. But when we're dealing with this spectrum of languages, it gets really difficult sometimes to decide for us at the OED, is this an English word? One of the most notorious examples is a translation of a text by Guy de Chauliac, who is a French physician and theoretician, called the Grande Chirurgie. And I did translation like this because it's so thinly done. So many of the words are still so French and Fraconic. For us, it causes a real headache to go, is this a French word that's just being written for an English audience? Or is it actually, as in the case of method, the first time a word is used in the English language to refer to something that becomes quite a main sense? And this sense of method of a medical procedure persisted for quite a number of centuries, but is now marked by the OED as obsolete. And it's not just this issue that we have in French, we have it in Latin, where sometimes they'll be talking about laws in Latin, and then they'll say, quod vocantur, what is called, and they'll give an English word. Sometimes the boundary between languages is really thin, and they might not have realized, as Catherine said, that they were speaking essentially a mishmash of two different languages. This really shows in a text called the Ormulum by a man called Orm up in the north around 1225, and he came up with his own little, it's lovely, he came up with his own little spelling system. He tried to standardize it, almost unreadable for modern eyes, but he does evidence a lot of these Norse words that, as Catherine said, had been in existence for a while, since the Viking invasions in the 9th and 10th centuries. Now, while we've got some of these texts that are very clearly international and interlingual, we've also got texts that are more smaller scale. We've got letters from particular families, like the Paston letters. We've got, especially after the 1362 Statute of Pleading, lots of legal documents and law court testimonies and household shopping lists done in English. And the abundance of evidence and the abundance of evidence about the writers mean that often with Middle English, but not all the time, we can give a date of composition. And this is another issue that we wrestle with at the OED, because we have a text that's written, and then maybe the original text doesn't survive, but copies do. What we'll do is we'll do double dating, and use the entry short to illustrate this. We'll give both the date of the actual text that survives, the physical text, and then we'll give a cheeky second date that says, but it was written in this time period. And if you see a date in brackets in the OED, it means this is the probable date of composition. If you see a date just as a number for Middle English text, that's what we will say is the date of the material text. And for Middle English, if we only see a number, it's only the date of the physical text that we're giving. It may be earlier. Often when we're dealing with Middle English, you'll also see a before it. So attested before, ante that date, often for 1425.
Right. Thanks, Eric. And that's really fascinating because talking about having the same concerns. Well, okay, you can have a look at short while I'm saying this, but it's really fascinating to me what you've just said, because speaking of having the same concerns as our predecessors from centuries ago, I mean, in my work as a world English editor, my question is always, is this an English word or is this just someone code switching, like a multilingual person, like in say in the Philippines or in Nigeria or in Singapore, just code switching from another language, right? And one important Middle English text that you didn't mention is actually the long poem Armulum, which contains evidence for hundreds of words that were borrowed from one of the languages that English borrowed from in that period in Middle English is Scandinavian. So and some of these Scandinavian borrowings include the pronouns they, them, and their. And I bring it up because it's interesting because it's really rare for pronouns to be borrowed from another language. But these pronouns were borrowed into English from Scandinavian, probably because there was a functional pressure to disambiguate the third person plural pronoun from the masculine and feminine singular. And I say this because, again, going back to the thread of, it's the same patterns over and over again, is that now in current English, we're once again seeing a change in the way we use these pronouns, again, as a response to functional pressure, but this time to have gender neutral alternatives to the gendered third person singular pronouns. So it really goes to show that people constantly adapt language to meet whatever expressive need they have at any given time, whether you're an Old English or Middle English or modern English speaker. And even the most stable features of a language, like grammatical elements, are not immune to that sort of change. And so now we can move on to another period of English, which is the early modern English. And this coincides with the period of British history from the Tudors to the Stuarts. And of course, when we think of the Tudors, we think of the Elizabethan period and of its greatest writer, William Shakespeare, who is renowned not only as a playwright, but also as a wordsmith. Now, the OED contains a large number of words first attested in Shakespeare's writings, but as editors continue to revise the dictionary, that number also continues to change. So Fiona, what has the revision of the OED revealed to us about Shakespeare's contributions to our lexicon?
Well, strangely, actually might show that he's not quite as innovative as we tend to think of him. Now, I'm not saying Shakespeare's not innovative, but as we revise the OED, part of what we're doing, we're bringing defining language into modern standard English. But also we are researching these terms to try and find if there's earlier and sometimes later examples of the word in use, so that we can tell the fullest story possible of a word according to modern scholarship. And in many cases where we did have Shakespeare as the first cited author, we have found earlier evidence, which means he wasn't the first person to use a particular word. So some examples: in the second edition of the OED, Shakespeare was the first cited author at fashionable, the adjective meaning of a person or a group of people, that dresses or behaves in accordance with current or latest fashions. He was the first person cited at heartache in the sense emotional pain or anguish. Zenith, in the figurative sense, the highest or best point of something, was another sense where he was the first quoted author. And at worthless, the adjective, he actually had a double whammy. He was the first person, as we thought, to have used it in the sense of a thing having no worth or value, but also of a person lacking worth or merit. They were from Titus Andronicus and Henry VI, Part 1, respectively. So he was, as we thought, the first person to actually use the word worthless at all. But as I said, revision of these entries have actually displaced him from the top spot, and he's no longer holding that position. Now, I don't think that's all that surprising, really, for a couple of reasons. When the editors were preparing the first edition of the OED, which of course is what the second edition largely is based on, Shakespeare would clearly have been a big hitter in terms of how widely he would have been read. The texts would have been quite easily available. Now we've got so much more access to texts, which did exist at the time, but the access would have been more limited. You would have really had to have had them, the book or the play or whatever in front of you, whether that be from your own personal collection or you've gone to a library to consult them. Now, at the click of a mouse or a keyboard stroke, we can obviously access a lot of these texts which have been digitized. So although they existed at the time that the editors were preparing the OED, they maybe couldn't necessarily get at them. And also, when you think about the types of words that we're talking about here, some of them, they were based on building blocks that were already in the language. So fashionable, fashion and able, they both existed. So Shakespeare had just put them together. So they weren't necessarily very, well, I'm not going to say they weren't exciting words, but they were words which, he very much had the tools available to make. So worthless as well, worth plus less. Zenith already existed in a different sense. So yes, he was using that figuratively, but the word still existed. He didn't come up with it. And maybe even more importantly is we have, I think, this idea that Shakespeare was this great neologist, but he was writing plays to be performed. So I don't think he was really in the business of trying to confound his audience with his, showing off these amazing words that he'd come up with. He wanted people to understand what they were seeing and to enjoy it and engage with it. So he did, though, use words and in perhaps a more interesting and metaphorical ways. And I think these are the things that have struck a chord and probably made the lasting and evocative impression on the language. So a really obvious example, but one which shows this quite well, is think of green-eyed, and in particular green-eyed monster, to talk about jealousy. Now, yellow was apparently traditionally the colour that was associated with jealousy. But that would now, I think, to us all thinking, we'd think of green. I mean, we talk about being green with envy, after all. And that particular phrase didn't actually come into English until the 19th century. But green-eyed in that figurative sense to allude to jealousy and jealous behaviour was first used by Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice. And the most evocative phrase of all, the green-eyed monster, that then came to be used in Othello. And these have stuck in the language and really become commonplace. And it's likely that green with envy may never have existed as a phrase had Shakespeare not laid that foundation for it in The Merchant of Venice with green-eyed and then coming on to green-eyed monster and Othello. So, I mean, that's our go-to terminology, really, green-eyed. And well, surprisingly, we have revised the entry for eyeball in OED, and Shakespeare is still the first person to use eyeball, meaning the whole eye. So it's not just about the poetic stuff. He did actually come up with some uses that aren't metaphorical.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I didn't know that about eyeball. So I think although the antedatings are changing in the OED, I think Shakespeare's reputation as a wordsmith is still very much safe. So
it's intact. I think we're okay.
It's still very much intact. But as great as he is, I mean, Shakespeare, the early modern English is not just about Shakespeare. After all, the reign of Elizabeth I is remembered not only for being the golden age of English literature, but also for being an era of overseas commercial venture and colonization that were there, which began at the end of the 15th century when Elizabeth's grandfather, actually Henry VII, commissioned the Italian explorer John Cabot to visit Newfoundland, which was later claimed for England in 1583. So now we can see, the English going out to different places in the world, bringing the language with them. Of course, we all know that settlement on the mainland of North America began with Jamestown in 1607. and also Puritan pilgrims founded the Plymouth colonies in 1620. Bermuda was colonized even earlier than that in 1612, and then St. Kitts in 1623, Barbados in 1627, and then, of course, all of you remember the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Around that time, English merchant voyages to the Indian Ocean began, and that took the English language to South Asia. And the East India Company established its first trading factory in India in 1612 and took possession of Bombay in 1668. So all of that happened during the early modern English period as well. And also in the early modern period, in the late 16th century, back here in Europe, that was a time when Wales was integrated administratively and legally into England. And then towards the end of the early modern period in 1707, the Act of Union united England and Scotland, creating the largely English-speaking UK we know today. So we can argue then that English as a global language began in the early modern period. And this European colonization not only brought European languages like English to colonized regions, but it also changed the very nature of these places. So Guyana, your area of expertise is in the Caribbean. It's one of those places that have been very much affected by colonization. So can you tell us about the impact of colonization on the linguistic landscape of this region?
Yeah, thank you, Danica. I'll try to be as brief as possible because I'm very aware of the fact that the Q&A should start in a minute. But yeah, I think when you think of the linguistic landscape of the Caribbean, you're not just thinking of English. It's very tempting to think it's only going to be English, but it's not just English. And so there are 4 things I want to touch on, and hopefully I get to all 4 of them. I do have a clock running next to me, so I have an idea of my time. So the first thing that happens because of colonization is that the colonizers, the Europeans, come into contact with the indigenous people. And by and large, these people are killed, they are decimated through illness or through war or through suicide because they do not want to work on the plantations of the colonizers. But before that happens, some of their words, especially things like flora and fauna, are borrowed into English and other European languages. So the first word I've brought with me is the word cassava. And we'll see that the first attestation of that is in 1555 from the indigenous language Taino. Yeah, so it's a really early word. But what's interesting about cassava is that it doesn't appear to have been borrowed from Taino into English, but it's been borrowed possibly from another language, possibly from Spanish or Italian, because if you look at the first source, it's from this text by Peter Marta of Angleria, and he was an Italian explorer who was working for Spain. And so it's probably a translation of that text. And so there's borrowing happening because of the contact of the different colonial groups. So that's the first type of thing I wanted to look at in the Caribbean in that from the early modern period onwards, just to show that this is happening a lot earlier than people give it credit for in some ways. The second type of borrowing that I think would be important to look at, or the type of how English is being affected in the Caribbean because of colonialism, is one of the darker or darkest aspects of colonialism is that you have the kidnapping of people from West Africa and then being forcibly moved to the Caribbean to work on sugarcane plantations, primarily, and other forms of labor as well. And they bring with them their language. Their languages are also repressed historically. So you do have pockets, say, of Trinidad Yoruba, but really the languages are repressed. And then there is, again, borrowing. And we see this very especially in foods. So I think the word I brought with me there was akra. And akra is a food that exists both in West Africa and the Caribbean. And so the OED etymology shows that really nicely, showing this link that is being brought over there. And the attestations also show that. Another word I had brought with me that shows this sort of movement of people now from different parts of the world, from different British colonies, is the word bap, which comes across from India to specifically Trinidad and Guyana, where at the end of the period of enslavement, there is a period of indentureship where people are less forcibly, but not completely honestly, brought over to work on the sugarcane plantations. And they bring with them their languages, and more words from those languages persist into the varieties of English spoken in the region. Really, not really by historical accident, but because they are in some ways isolated. So particularly kinship terms, which BAP is, it's a term for father, are going to survive in ways that kinship terms, say from indigenous people, don't survive. But last but not least, I mean, there are two other things, but yeah, I'll do both of them really quickly. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I think is the most exciting type of word formation in Caribbean Englishes. And that's what happens that really shows that two different groups of people are coming into contact. And the word I've brought for you there is Mapapir zanana. So if you are from Trinidad, you know Mapapir is a type of snake, and Mapapir zanana is a type of snake it's a bushmaster in British English, and it looks a bit like a pineapple. And Mapapir is borrowed from a Carib word. Yeah, so that's the indigenous group. But Zanana is borrowed from French via French Creole, so a Trinidad French Creole, meaning pineapple or anana. Yeah. And then we have this new compound, Mapapir zanana, which is part of Trinidadian English. And I think compounds like that are really exciting because they're telling a huge story. But of course, what I don't want to leave you with is the impression that the borrowings that happen as a result of colonialism are only going to be from other languages, because you have really interesting things happening in English as well. And I believe there is a slide for ignorant, because I think ignorance is a really interesting word, because what you often have happening, not only in Caribbean Englishes, but in other varieties of English around the world, is that words are used with a meaning that is different from British English or American English or even other places. So here we have ignorant, which in its first sense, if you look at sense one, means unaware of the facts, like not aware of something. But when we have sense six, which is the Caribbean meaning of angry, quick-tempered, as in to get on, ignorant. And in some ways, that's just a separate meaning. But I think it might also be related to the earlier British regional and colloquial meaning of a person lacking in manners or refinement, that then just gets sort of expanded in the Caribbean sense. Or perhaps it's a bit restricted, but a slightly different meaning in the Caribbean setting, but it's still the English form. And I also think words like that are really interesting because it's telling the story of English, and how English is changing and how meanings are changing, or indeed how meanings that are lost in one variety of English are retained in another variety. So that's all I wanted to say on that.
Thanks, Diane. So it's really curious as well that, in the early modern period, so we talked about how English suddenly started to become the international language it is during that time. And it's also the time when the greatest works in English are being written, and the language itself was going way beyond England. But it was also the time when English was being criticized for being, not such a cool language, bit inelegant, bit ineloquent, not fit for writing literature. But a bit later, people began to appreciate it more. But that's when people started moaning about how, the language is being invaded by foreign words and technical jargon. And that's really not so different from the situation we have today, where English really is the most dominant language in the world. I think it's safe to say that. And yet English speakers still complain about how it's being ruined by, the usual suspects like youth slang, technical jargon, foreignisms, and even in a much faster speed than before. But I really hope that we've shown in this short historical exploration of English that just like any other language, English is a living system, and it's constantly changing because of various factors. And, you have the usual changes in pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary that happens when a language is really just old and used over hundreds and hundreds of years by generations of people. But then you also have English coming into contact with different languages, as Gian, and explained, through colonization, but also through trade, migration, globalization, and then really just changes in society that lead to changes in language. As we've seen in with Catherine in Middle English, where we can still feel the impact of the Norman conquest today on English. So change really is far from being a sign of the decline of English. It's a sign that it's still alive and thriving and capable of adapting. And we can really see how English is able to adapt to these different environments in the OED's coverage of world Englishes. And so I'd just like to mention a little bit about that since September last year, every one of the OED's quarterly updates has included new and revised entries from different varieties of world Englishes. So if you look at the OED's World English Hub, which will appear on your screen shortly, that you can see that these varieties include not only those spoken in countries where English is a majority first language, like Canada, Australia, or Ireland, but also those varieties used in countries like Nigeria and Philippines, where English is generally spoken as a second language alongside other local languages. And world Englishes for the OED also include not just varieties that are specific to individual countries, but also to wider regions, such as the Caribbean, which Gian has just described to us, and also East Africa, for example. And they're not only those varieties that are spoken by large populations, like those in, let's say, in India or South Africa, but they can also be used by very small communities, for example, like on the Isle of Man, which we covered in our update last month. So in all of these updates for all of these varieties, we see the same patterns of language change and lexical innovation that Gian talked to us about. And we put a lot of work into monitoring and documenting the lexicon of all varieties of English covered by the OED because, it's really part of our wider effort to make the OED as representative as possible of the way that English is actually being used in the world today, and to make all of the lexical and historical information in a dictionary as accessible as possible to all of its users. So all of this information that we've been talking about, starting from Old English through to Middle English, Early Modern, and Modern English. Now, speaking of OED users, among the most dedicated users of the OED are people who study and teach the history of English, and I suspect a lot of them are in the audience today. So Catherine, as one of those people, how do you use the OED in your teaching?
Thanks, Danica. My old supervisor, my former supervisor, Christian Kay, once said, I don't know how anybody can live without the OED. And that is my experience in my research and in my teaching, I must say. So, in teaching, I use OED with students and they use it in a number of ways. So sometimes it's about retrieving, groups of words or groups of words of a particular kind. So often I'm using, or my students are using, the dictionary to search for words borrowed from French or words borrowed from, any language, sometimes in a particular period. Sometimes they're using the OED to retrieve words of a particular kind. So I talked about looking for words that have a particular meaning, looking for groups of words, and sometimes kind of tracking why the most usual word for a concept changes over time, for example. And OED is really good for all of that because you can use the advanced searches to pull out words of different kinds by attestation, by meaning, by other kinds of labels as well. So we use that a lot. And then the other way, I guess, that we're often using the dictionary is to track the history of one word, of course, which is the way it's structured. So perhaps to look at its formal history, but more often for me, because I'm particularly interested in word meaning, I'm interested in historical semantics, I'm often using it with students to think about the polysemous words with multiple meanings, and to think about how those meanings emerge, how they arise, and how they connect to one another. So, for example, in one of the courses that I teach at UCL, that's in our master's course, English Words, students actually have to write a commentary in their exams, or they can choose to talk about the different senses of a particular word and think about how they might have emerged and how they're related to one another. And I guess to finish as well, the other course where the dictionary is essential in my teaching is our History of English course. And I talk to students a little bit about how often in the history of one word, it's a kind of potted version of the history of English more generally. So, for example, if you look at a word like night, it shows enormous variations of spellings that line up with periods where you see more and less variation, for example. It shows changes in pronunciation that also are really significant. It used to be pronounced knicht, okay, but that's not the case anymore, and you can trace that through its spellings. And its meaning changes. So knecht in Old English is a man or a boy or a servant, but in modern English it's somebody, either the one riding on the white horse with the sword, or somebody who's had a kind of social, civil kind of honour. So it's really interesting to track that and to think about how that fits in with more general social changes in the history of, well, you know, society in different kind of countries.
All right. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Catherine. But of course, your work in teaching people about the history of English goes beyond just your work in the classroom at UCL, as we've seen in your work on From Old English to World Englishes. So why do you think it's important for linguists to engage with the wider public in this way, Amy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. And just thinking about our particular project, From Old English to World Englishes, I think one of the things we are really aware of was the slight sort of misconception about the history of English and the English language. I mean, from what Catherine was just saying, you know, it's obvious that this is a really rich history, and it's one in which we see different sort of types of variation at different periods. But I think there's a sort of misconception, perhaps, that there's a sort of fixed form of English that we see in dictionaries and in textbooks and grammar books, and anything that varies from that is somehow wrong. And so what we really wanted to show to the people who engaged with our workshops is that the story of English is one of variation and of change, and also that the Englishes that we all speak now are all a part of that history as well. So that's sort of what we were trying to show.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and I'm also, you know, what surprised me when I first joined the OED was that my training included media training, and I really needed it because answering questions from the media became an important part of my job. And it never ceases to amaze me just how interested the public is in OED updates. So Fiona, as the face and voice of the OED, you are always closely involved in all of our public communication. So why do you think words generally and the OED specifically hold such fascination for the public?
I think people are interested because words are how we communicate. So whether that's written word, whether it's spoken word, whether it's signing, there's that level of interest because it's the building blocks of our communication. I mean, some people maybe don't want to launch into the seafarer and find out about the vocabulary used there, or they maybe want to know what word means, where it comes from, are not interested in their cognates. But I think as well, living through a period of time where there's changes in language, I think looking at the OED, and this is what we always try and get across when we're talking to people, showing them that we're showing the whole history of a word throughout its time, whether it's changed meanings, whether it's developed new senses, whether they've come out, gone out of the language, remained in the language. I think it can help to reassure that language now is just behaving in exactly the way that it always has. All words were new at some point. So if you're a bit confounded by a word that you've heard young people use and you don't know what it means, think about every single word that you're very familiar with and very comfortable with using was new once. And so maybe someone 400 years ago was left scratching their head because youngsters were using a word that they'd never heard of. So I think it's mostly because it's the language of our communication, and the OED can just put a slightly different slant on it by showing its history throughout the whole time. And I think that really engages people's interest.
Great. Amazing. I mean, I could keep on talking to you all for hours and hours, but unfortunately we only have one and we need to move on to the questions. But before that, first we need to reveal the answer to our questions. So let's do the kenning first. So 35% of you says it's graveyard, 2% battlefield, 49% human body, and the rest for the others. And everyone on here is really, really, 49% of you are really, really clever because you've figured it out. You've sussed it out that that Bahnhofs is actually the human body. So it's a house for your bones, which is amazing. Old English speakers, very creative. And then the last one, our other poll about the oldest word, which one? Maybe some of you tried. Maybe from what you've learned in the past hour, that you might have wanted to change your vote. But the final poll, again, our audience is very clever because you almost got it. The answer is actually, so the winner in the poll is well, in the sense of adjective, in the use as an adjective at 46%, but the actual answer is the runner-up, which is the verb friend. So the use of verb to mean a friend, which is actually much older than you would imagine, because you'd think that, oh, this came from Facebook, right? Facebook invented this when you started friending each other all over the place, right? So we have a question here that you might be able to answer, Catherine. It's about Middle English. Did emerging bilingualism contribute to the loss of inflections in Middle English, and can this development be interpreted as an early form of creolization?
Just choose the most difficult one, Danica, why don't you? Right, I have to say I'm absolutely not an expert on this particular question. It seems likely that the loss of inflections was starting earlier than Middle English. So what people tend to think now is that this is a process that was already begun in Old English, and it sped up in Middle English, and that's where we really see it happen dramatically. And certainly I think some scholars think that the influence of the Romance languages, contributed to that and kind of encouraged that, because of course you had lots of words coming in that came from a different grammatical system, and had different different sets of endings in their source languages. But I am not an expert. Eric may know more than me. But yeah, really good, really interesting question, and enormously complex question, actually.
Do you have any comments, Eric?
Nothing that will summarize it better than Catherine has. It's a very vexatious issue that a number of scholars debate quite heavily, and I don't think there has been much take up outside of the idea of creolization outside of that debate.
Oh yeah, thanks. Sorry, I forgot to talk about creolization. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, another question that might be for you, Fiona. So Avery Andros asked, the OED was born in an era in which grammar, spelling, and reference texts were largely prescriptive, but it sounds like today it's really more of a descriptive text, both of historical and contemporary English. So would you say that the earliest editions of the OED were more prescriptive or descriptive, and how has that evolved over time? So this is more about the history of the OED than of English.
I would say that they were pretty descriptive. I think that's always really been the point of the OED. The reason it was born was because there was a need to describe the language that people were actually using, rather than some of the older dictionaries, going back to Caudray in 1603, I think it was. They were more like instruction manuals, talking about difficult words and hard words, so words that you should learn in order to be able to, be seen as clever. And the OED has never been about that. It's about describing the language that people were actually using. Now, yes, there are sometimes it might have used slightly, well, what would seem to us as archaic or judgmental language, but it was very much that was very much reflecting how some people might have seen this as being using. And of course, language has changed and the world has changed and our views on the world has changed. But they were very much about, as I said, showing how the language was used. So they were descriptive. They probably sound more prescriptive, but that I think is just our modern ear will read certain things in a particular way and think it sounds more prescriptive than it is. But it's one of the great things, I think, when you start working on dictionaries is that before you might have thought dictionaries are there to tell you, yes, they're there to tell you what words mean, but to tell you which words you should use and how you should use them. But the meanings are all derived, obviously, from how people use it. And I think it's great that the OED has trailblazed that ever since the first fascicle was published.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we always keep on saying as OED editors, the OED is not prescriptive, it's descriptive, but there's always still that people still have that kind of urge to have some kind of authority, and the OED and the OED being one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known dictionary in the English language. They kind of look to the OED to have that function. But of course, that's not the primary function of the OED, is to describe the language rather than to prescribe to people how to use it.
And they'll often think if a word's not in the OED, then it somehow isn't a real word. And this could be true of other dictionaries, when actually it's just that it hasn't yet been recorded. And that's the thing to keep in mind.
Okay, so why do you think that people worry so much about language changing? Like, why would something like, use slang, business jargon, why does that, why does that bother us so much?
I think what I perhaps said goes away to answering this, in that I think it's because it can be disconcerting when people start using language that you maybe don't really have that much of a handle on. But I think part of the problem is also perhaps the ubiquity, as people see it, of some of these things. So they'll think, oh, well, I've never heard people use this word before, and now it's all I ever hear. And sometimes it's the fact that people are using it, as you might think, constantly, that is actually perhaps part of why people get annoyed with, certainly with business jargon. I mean, doing the job we do, Eric, as you'll know, and Danica, you can't think about that when you're defining a word. It doesn't really matter whether I like a word or not. I have to be professional. Is there evidence for this word? How are people using it? It doesn't matter what you think about it. But I think that it is maybe that ubiquity, as well as nobody likes to kind of not really understand what's going on. It can make you feel a bit, disconcerted. So I think maybe that's why people, have trouble with that. And it goes back to my point before. Remember that all of these words that you're completely comfortable with, they were used for the first time sometime.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, new words being invented and being brought into the language and irritating some folk, we have a request here, Gian, for you to give more examples of borrowing and mixing. If you have any other interesting words that you could share.
Yes. So I saw that question and I cheated a bit, because I'm currently working on a chapter in a book where I'm analyzing all the entries in this dictionary to see what's happening there. That's Liz Weiner's Dictionary of Trinidad English Creole. And so because of that, I have a little cheat sheet of work I've been doing. And so I've found two that would be familiar to some people, I think. And one is dance shango, which dance is your English word, and shango is borrowed from Orisha. And the other one I found was dasheen bush, which is a vegetable of leafy green that people in the Caribbean use very often in cooking, specifically on a Sunday. And dasheen is actually from French Creole, not from an African language, which is what I thought initially it should be, but I was wrong. And then bush from English. And so you have these quite nice pairings. Those are the two I found on my quick sheet.
Right, thanks, yeah. When evaluating words and deciding whether to add them to the dictionary or not, how do you determine whether a word is a legitimate different word from another word, or if it's simply a misspelling or printing mistake? I think I can take that one, but Eric and Fiona can also comment. I think it's really a matter of frequency. If it's something that just happens once and we never see it again, then probably it's just somebody's mistake. But if it happens and then we see more evidence of the new spelling later on in the history of the word, then it's probably an indication that it's something that it's an actual change that happened. And the same thing with borrowings, right? If there's enough evidence of a word from a different language being used in English, and that's an indication then that the word has been adopted as an English word. So it's really a matter of seeing the frequency of use over time. Did I get that right, Fiona?
That sounds pretty good to me, Eric. Think so?
Yeah,
that's how we do things, right?
Yeah, I just add that for the early period where we don't have standardized spelling, there's actually quite a small array of different spellings that can be used. So you might look at weird with a Y in it and go, that's really odd.
Exactly.
But it would be never spelt with an O, for example. So it's actually quite a small number of variations we can look at.
Yeah, just to see that. I mean, I would advise you, for example, to look for the OED entry for love, and just see how many ways we've spelled that word. You would like to think, what other spelling could there be for love? But dozens apparently. So you could go to the OED entry to see just how much spelling variation there's been for that word over time. And well, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time and we need to wrap up. But again, I would like to thank everyone, Catherine, Eric, Amy, Gian, and Fiona. Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion over the past hour and a half. I mean, I wish we had 3 hours instead, but I have to all let you all go live your lives, because there are other things that interest us apart from the history of English. At least I think so. We do have other interests, right?
Yes.
Although it's not that obvious sometimes. I feel
wrong
like
answer.
it occupies my every waking hour. But I'm glad to have been able to share this hour and a half with all of you, and to have the benefit of your vast knowledge of the history of English. And I hope, and of course, our guests from UCL, you're going to continue the From Old English to World Englishes project. So good luck with all future endeavors. And thank you once again. And I hope to see everyone again soon and to have another one of these discussions. Thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.